and now the session is being recorded. So before we begin the session, I'd just like to go through a bit of housekeeping. So as we've been mentioning, as people have been joining, please do make sure that your microphones are off. This will just help to eliminate any background noises, any echoes, so that we can hear the presenter clearly. Secondly, as I said before, the session is being recorded, and a recording of the session will be available on our project website within 2 weeks of the session. We also will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the project, and then we will fill them for the presenter at the end of the presentation. And of course, if you've got any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the chat function. I'll be monitoring it and I will answer your questions. So just on our agenda for today, we're first going to hear from Professor Frida Fosdal, who's the lead investigator for this project. She'll introduce the project and give an overview of it. And then we'll be hearing from Associate Professor David Mickler, who's going to be presenting his exploration on the nature of diaspora diplomacy in the context of relations between Australia and the African continent. And then after David's presentation, we'll have an audience Q&A. As I said again, please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function for any questions. So first, I'll just introduce Professor Frida Fosdal. So Frida is Professor Sociology, Dean Global Futures at Curtin University. Her research focuses on migration, race and ethnicity, refugee settlement, racism, nationalism, global citizenship, and cosmopolitanism. Frida is the lead investigator on this project as well. So Frida, please give us an overview of the project, and I'll go through the slides for you.
Thanks, Natando. So it's lovely to see everybody again. This is, as Natando mentioned, the fourth of our webinars, which are basically designed to give a running commentary of the research as it is rolling out, basically. So we are, if you'll go to the first slide, Natando.
This one?
I'm not sure whether I'm seeing the right slides or not. I've got David's front cover slide there, sorry.
I have the research team up.
I can't see it. I don't know why that is. Can others see the research team, or are you stuck on the... Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure why that is. Okay, so I'll just have to... given that I can't see it, and I'm not quite sure why that is, maybe... oh, there we go. Sorry. Yep. Okay, got it. So yes, this is the research team, 9 chief investigators from across the universities that you can see on the right of your screen there. It's a very diverse team of a range of different disciplines and different sort of lived experiences, African migrants in Australia or people researching in the area or with other interests in terms of Africans in Australia. And the next slide, thanks, Natando. Basically, one of our key goals with this is to engage in research that doesn't use a deficit narrative. A lot of the research that has been undertaken has been about the challenges that Africans in Australia face, and we were keen to tell a slightly different story about the contributions and engagement that Africans in Australia are participating in. So we're interested in understanding the complex dynamics of the African diaspora, their transnational engagements, as well as their local engagements, and particularly how their political and economic agency is exercised. So we're doing that through a range of different projects, which are outlined here. I won't go through each of them, but basically we've done an analysis of some of the census data that exists. We also have just wound up a national survey, which we have over 830 participants in that. And so we'll be hopefully giving a webinar with some of the early findings from that in the next few months as well. That's the first of its kind, such a large survey of African background Australians. We also are doing a social media and policy analysis, and then mainly what David will be talking about today is this set of interviews that we've been conducting with community members, but also political leaders, diplomats, and African community leaders as well. David will, of course, be focusing on the research that we've conducted so far with the political leaders, diplomats, and so on, looking at diaspora diplomacy. So next slide. I think this is the last of our slides. Yep. Thanks a lot. I think Notando will introduce our colleague, David, who's second CI on the project.
Yeah, thanks for that, Farida. Just a quick note before I introduce David, I did notice on the chat that more people aren't able to see the slides. So I'll be workshopping that after I read out David's bio, but you should be able to see it after. So just now, my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor David Mickler, who will be presenting today. So David Mickler is the Global Africa and Director, Center for Australia-Africa Relations at Curtin University, where he's also an Associate Professor in International Relations in the Faculty of Humanities. Beyond Curtin, David serves as co-chair of the flagship Australia-Africa Universities Network, as Deputy Co-Chair of the Ayora Indian Ocean University Network, and as Australian representative to the Indian Ocean Rim Academic Group. His research explores Africa's international politics, including a focus on Australia-Africa relations. His books include New Engagement, Contemporary Australian Foreign Policy Towards Africa, The African Union, Addressing the Challenges of Peace, Security and Governance, and Africa and the Sustainable Development Goals. His current research projects include co-editing a collaborative volume entitled Australia-Africa Science Diplomacy, Research Collaboration, Policy Impact and International Cooperation, and serving as the chief investigator on the Australian Research Council Discovery Project, African Impact in Australia, the latter from which the current webinar is derived. And now I'll hand over to you, David, for your presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Notando and Farida, and hello everyone, great to be with you, and hopefully we can sort through any of those technical issues in the next few minutes. If you go to the next slide, Notando. So I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting here today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Next slide. So this part of the overall Australia Research Council Discovery Project is looking at the nature of what we call academic diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy in Australia-Africa relations. It's a subset of the project. I'm particularly interested in the sort of the notions of political agency. Other parts of the project are looking at economic and so on. So this focus on diaspora diplomacy cuts across different parts of the project. And it's so far been quite an interesting way of thinking about the nature of the African diaspora in Australia. So as has been mentioned, it's a part of the wider project that we're working on over this 3-year period. It's also still a work in progress. We had hoped to have finished the interviews by now, but it's been a little bit tricky getting some of the final interviews with diplomats. There's still a few to go. So it's still a little bit of a work in progress, and we'll be presenting probably by mid-year a policy paper that will be publicly available through our website. And then there'll be an academic paper that follows that with the full details once we've wrapped up all of the data collection. The final paper will be a co-authored paper with Professor Farida Fosdar and another colleague of ours, Professor Chris Ezike in South Africa at the University of Pretoria. He's not formally part of this project, but separately we've been working on some other aspects of diaspora diplomacy. So it shows that these kind of ARC projects can build wider collaborations outside of the immediate project team. Next slide, please. So to set a bit of context, we just wanted to take you back a few years when we first started looking at the nature of the African diaspora in Australia, which really led into this larger ARC project. And that earlier work was trying to understand this question of, what are diasporas and can we consider Africans in Australia to be a diaspora? So a paper that was co-authored with Farida and another one of our project team members, Sarah Pratt-Quick, and I looked at what are the characteristics of diasporas. And we identified in a broad sense people living outside of their original home country or region who have a range of the following characteristics: shared origins, sense of collective identity or kinship or experience, an orientation to their region of origin, various forms of transnational engagement across different realms: political, economic, social, cultural, also being the target of home governments in various positive and negative ways, and also being constituted both by sort of internal dynamics as well as external contexts, which shape how people perceive and relate to members of the diaspora. We also, as part of this project, have now done, as the first phase, a demographic analysis of the African diaspora in Australia. Our colleague Sarah Pratt-Quick did that analysis, and you can actually access that full demographic paper on our website. But as part of that, she identified from the 2021 census, the most recent census we've had in Australia, that the African background population in Australia is highly diverse, but also numbered now at over 800,000 people, if you include both first and second generation. So this equates to about 3%, just over 3% of the Australian population at that 2021 census, which is not an insubstantial number. And we've particularly seen a very large increase in both the volume and the diversity of African migrants coming to Australia since the 1990s. And that population has essentially doubled in the last 20 or so years. The other part of what we looked at was, what are the kind of core activities of the diaspora in Australia that would lead us to have a better understanding of the nature of how they exist and contribute to both Australia and to transnational relations. And so we found that there's evidence in Australia of Pan-African consciousness, which underpins a sense of collective identity in the development of national, state and local African Australian community organisations. And one of our project team members is looking specifically at the role of the political agency of African community organisations in Australia. That's Ruby, our PhD student, and she'll be doing a separate presentation on that in the future. Also that there's a range of activities from governments, NGOs, communities and individuals that engage across political, economic, social and cultural realms that are contributing meaningfully to both Australian society and to their countries of origin, as well as to their identity formulation. So there's a lot of work being done in those areas by members of the diaspora and different organisations, but also at the same time that there's significant diversity and important cleavages among these populations. So we've got to be careful about how we frame them and the homogenising tendencies that sometimes exist. At the end of that paper, we basically said that there needs to be much more research into the African diasporas in Australia, and particularly, as Frida said earlier, beyond the deficit lens. And this is really what led into this large project that we're doing now through the ARC. Next slide, thanks. So this particular part of the project that I'm working on is looking firstly at the nature of diaspora diplomacy in Australia-Africa relations. We want to understand what that means and what it looks like. And then as part of the broader thematic of the ARC project, which is using the notion of agency, we want to try and understand how the practices of diaspora diplomacy can be understood as modes of political agency for the African diasporas in Australia. And then finally, looking more at the kind of policy recommendations side of things, we wanted to try to identify what both the Australian government as well as various African governments could do to enhance the role of diasporas as agents contributing meaningfully to the broader development of relations between our continents. So that's the aim of this part of the paper. In terms of the methodology, we've obviously done the demographic analysis, so we're drawing on that. But then we're doing a range of interviews with African diplomats in Australia, with community leaders, but also with Australian political entities such as Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The part we haven't quite done yet is the interviews of Australian diplomats in Africa. The project itself doesn't, the scope of the project doesn't really extend to doing extensive interviews in Africa, but we wanted to try and bring in a few of the key diplomats to also get their sense of how they understand the role of diasporas in the diplomatic sphere, but also to look at the other side, which is what we might call Australian Africans or the Australian diaspora in Africa, and how they may or may not be contributing more broadly to relationships across the Indian Ocean. So we're still in the process of that. We're aiming to get to about 30 interviews that are specifically relevant to this part of the project. And we've obviously gone through human ethics approval. Okay, next slide, thanks. Okay, so just quickly on the demographic side to get an understanding of the population that we're talking about. So if we think of the total estimated global African diaspora, that number's in the hundreds of millions. And we can understand that as both a longer term historical process or series of historical processes, a big part of which was the slave trade, as well as the broader colonial processes that took place over a number of centuries. Of course, we saw the forcible removal of millions of Africans from the continent to other parts of the world through both the slave trade and the broader colonial processes. The largest movement of which was the transatlantic slave trade. Over 11 million people forcibly removed through that process, and then obviously over several centuries becoming part of the wider African diaspora that continues to exist today. On the other side, through the trans-Saharan and trans-Indian Ocean slave trade, there was another 5 or 5.5 million people transported to different parts of this side, where we are on the Indian Ocean side of Africa. There's been some interesting recent work which is trying to specifically look at the connections between the global slave trade and the convicts labour system that was brought to Australia by the British, and to trace the African connection through those processes. So the recent book by our colleague Santila Chingaipa looks specifically at that through her work on black convicts. But it's a lesser known part of the story of international slavery and the forcible movement of peoples through the colonial system. So the descendants of people over these many centuries contribute to this large global African diaspora, but in many cases, those people have become historically disconnected from their places of origin in the continent, and that's an ongoing source of problem for them, and also affects the nature of diaspora relations because of that. Can we go to the next slide, thanks? So the historical African diaspora numbers in the hundreds of millions, as we've just said. Larger populations, of course, moved to the Americas and to Europe. If we're looking at the Africa-born diaspora, so those people who were born on the African continent but then subsequently migrated to other parts of the world outside of the continent, the total size of that segment of the African diaspora is about 40 million people, according to the UN's 2020 numbers. So just the people that were born in the continent but have now migrated and live outside the continent, around 40 million people. And from that, Australia has the 12th largest of the Africa-born population outside of the African continent. So it's a significant destination for African migrants in the more contemporary period. Next slide, thanks. And this is through the work of Sarah Prout-Quick, as I mentioned, and you can get the full demographic analysis from our website. The breakdown of those numbers through the last 120 or so years through the national census process shows a rapid growth in the African diaspora in Australia, particularly of people born in Africa who have migrated. So you can see from the table below that up until about the sort of 1950s, it was largely people from Egypt and South Africa in small numbers who migrated to Australia. But then through a range of factors, including changing migration policies, the end of the White Australia policy, and so on, we saw a very, very significant increase in the African diaspora, both in total numbers, but also in terms of the number of countries in which people have come from, to the point where now that number's over 500,000 people. And as we said, if you include the second generation, that would be over 800,000 people. So it's becoming a significant part of the Australian story, with rapid growth in the last couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades. Next slide, please. If we then break that down further into specific countries of origin, we can see that the largest component of the African diaspora in Australia by a long way is people from South Africa, over 200,000 people at the last census, with countries like Egypt, Zimbabwe, Mauritius, Kenya, Sudan, Ethiopia, Nigeria also having large diasporas with more than 10,000 people born in those countries having migrated to Australia. You can see from the map there's a heavier concentration from southern and eastern Africa, and less so from West and Central. So that just gives you a sense, if you look at the 2021 column, of what are the largest, at least national groupings of the diaspora in Australia. Okay, next slide, thanks. Okay, so that's just a bit of the demographic context. And now I wanted to turn more to the focus of this particular paper, which is looking at the connections between diasporas and diplomacy. So if we think about traditional understandings of diplomacy, they are largely state-based understandings, formal processes of governments. So different definitions emphasize this: the management of international relations by negotiation, the methods by which these relations are adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys, the business or the art of the diplomatist. Diplomats in ministries of foreign affairs and missions abroad represent, report, and communicate on states' interests. And these twin notions of representation and communication, so representing governments abroad, but also communicating information about your country to others and bringing back information about other countries to your country. These are seen as the two core formal functions of diplomatic actors in the traditional understanding of the system. There's various forms of diplomacy, which we don't need to go into, but they're performed in different settings with different combinations of countries, with different particular functions, to coerce, to deal with crises, to build bilateral relationships, to work on complex issues in a multilateral setting. There's newer forms such as digital diplomacy, public diplomacy, so communicating to foreign publics, quiet diplomacy, trying to deal with issues behind the scenes, not so much in the public, and of course a range of consular services that embassies provide to their citizens abroad. What we're more interested in here, though, is what we might call non-traditional forms of diplomacy. So diplomatic roles played by a range of non-state actors, including what we call track 1.5 and track 2 diplomacy. So types of diplomacy that are operating below the official level of governments. And a really interesting way of thinking about this is a concept of intersocial diplomacy, or an evolving concept of intersocial diplomacy, reflecting the more globalized world that we live in, with a range of different actors increasingly playing important roles in international relations in ways that were previously reserved largely for states. So Buddy, who's one of the proponents of this concept, says that intersocial diplomacy designates a form of diplomacy between state and non-state actors, or just among non-state actors, that manages the gap separating civil societies from each other. Okay, so it's a more social form of diplomacy that may interact with governments, but doesn't necessarily go through formal channels of state-to-state relations. So I think it's in this context that we can most usefully see the roles of diasporas as performing forms of intersocial diplomacy. And if we think about what diasporas actually do, as we mentioned earlier from that previous work, they do perform a range of transnational social, cultural, political, and economic activities. They're very active in some cases in doing that. From trade, from political advocacy, from bringing together different groups for social and cultural performances. They are, in fact, in many ways, the face of relations between countries, this people-to-people relations that is often what is quite visible to ordinary people in different countries. Diasporas can also perform some roles of representation. As we mentioned, representation and communication are seen as two of the traditional functions of diplomacy. So in some ways, diasporas can represent countries or communities, although that's often quite contested. And that's one of the key issues, I think, that is a challenge for the way in which diaspora diplomacy is recognized in different countries. What particular representational role are they playing, and is that contested by others? They also perform communication and information sharing functions. They become, in a sense, sources of knowledge, both about home countries and countries of origin. They provide regular updates. They provide, obviously, a bridge of knowledge sharing that sits outside perhaps formal channels that can be very meaningful in getting a good understanding of different societies. They also are involved in ongoing negotiation of different spaces of their identities and of different sets of interests that might be at play. So they're performing what we might say are roles that traditional diplomats play, but doing it in this more intersocial context rather than necessarily at the formal level. So from that context, I think what we're quite interested in here in this project is looking at the links between that intersocial form of diplomacy and the more formal channels for relations between countries, between Australia particularly and the countries of Africa. And in that space, we're looking at the potential agency of actors in the diaspora to influence the more formal processes of diplomacy between countries. So they are performing these intersocial roles already. We can see that in many different realms. But what is the relationship between those roles and the more formal diplomatic channels that exist between Australia and African countries? That's where we're interested to focus this paper. Okay, next slide. I think we missed one. Yeah. So it's also important here to understand the historical role of African diasporas around the world as agents of political change and of economic development. So if we go back in time, we can see that the diasporic Pan-African movement was really quite instrumental in partnership with a range of actors on the African continent in the successful struggle ultimately to defeat European colonial rule in Africa, which was largely achieved after the Second World War. Much of the activity around those anti-colonial struggles was taking place in the diaspora through different newly organizing forms of diasporic activity. And several of the leaders of those movements, many of which were outside of the continent or moving between the diaspora and the continent, ultimately became the heads of newly independent African states. So there was a very important role played by those people in the historical diaspora in the anti-colonial struggle. And so the politics of Pan-Africanism has an important history in the diaspora as well as on the continent itself, particularly in the United States and in Europe and the Caribbean. And the people involved with this in these movements came from a range of different backgrounds. Some were former slaves, some were sort of refugees within the colonial system, others were exiles from the colonies that were being controlled on the continent, and then also a range of intellectuals as well as other activists. So they played this very important anti-colonial role. They had links with other international movements, the communist movement in some cases, Pan-Islamic movements, Afro-Asian movements, later in time, the anti-apartheid movement, in exile. And of course, the ANC had developed a very extensive diplomatic network of its own in exile, including through the diaspora, which it then successfully imported into formal government when South Africa transitioned to democracy in 1994. They generally, even though they might have had differences on a range of outcomes and ideological orientations, they generally shared an opposition to Eurocentric worldviews, of course, the racism of colonization, and broadly sought different forms of liberation, both in the diaspora and on the continent itself. So these sort of slogans of Africa for the Africans were very typical of that kind of movement. Broadly concerned with the rights of people of African descent. They organised a range of international conferences, which really gave a lot of organisational power and momentum to the anti-colonial movement, again in partnership with movements on the continent itself, through a range of ultimately successful public and political lobbying of colonial powers, working from within the colonial metropoles to break down the credibility of colonial rule. What we've seen since then is that these kind of Pan-African movements have fluctuated between sort of more popular orientations, including those from the diaspora, and more state-centric forms. So we see, for example, in the African Union, a state-centric form of Pan-Africanism, but at the same time, alongside that, we have ongoing popular Pan-African movements that bring in the very important ongoing role of the diaspora. We can also see that members of the African diaspora today are important agents of economic development. So the estimated spending power, if you think broadly about the historical African diaspora, is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Very difficult to actually quantify that. In terms of remittances from the diaspora back to the continent, the UN estimated that in 2022 that had surpassed $100 billion, which is more than official development assistance and often foreign direct investment into Africa. So this is a substantial source of revenue for development inside African countries coming from the diaspora. And this gives the diaspora, in a sense, a form of agency, a form of power in the way in which governments and other entities try to court them and court their influence and court their resources. Next slide. So the African Union itself has developed a diaspora diplomacy agenda. And this is something that we didn't see as explicitly in the Organization of African Unity, the prior organization to the AU. But since 2002, when the AU came into existence, it quickly recognized the important role of the diaspora in the continental affairs and the African Union itself. It went on to actually name the diaspora outside of the African continent as the 6th region of Africa. So if you look at the map there, you have the 5 African Union regions, so North, East, South, West, and Central. And then you have a 6th region, the diaspora, which is now formally considered part of the African continent through the African Union's designation there. The African Union also came up with its own definition of the diaspora, which is peoples of African origin living outside the continent, irrespective of their citizenship and nationality, and who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent and the building of the African Union. So some people have said that's quite an instrumentalist definition, which is focused on identity being linked to how much commitment of resources there would be back to the continent. But there is now this definition formally by the African Union. They also created a specific office within the African Union Commission, the Citizens and Diaspora Organizations Directorate, or CEDAW, which formally is the link between the diaspora and the continental organization. The AU convened a major diaspora summit in South Africa in 2012. They also established, relevant to our context, the Pan-African Australasian Diaspora Network, PADAN, which is again the formal organisation linking the African diaspora in Australia to the African Union Diaspora Office. And through these processes and others, the African Union itself engages in now a range of different forms of diaspora diplomacy. Next slide. So Mukumi Muguru's work is really quite instrumental here. So he argues that the essence of diplomacy of the diaspora is to enhance and maintain linkages between members of the diaspora and citizens of the home state, and especially to encourage the diaspora to participate in the economic and political processes of the home country. So you can see here how important diaspora is viewed by many home governments, both politically and economically. He identifies 4 different diasporic communities that are of interest to the African Union, two outside the continent, so the historical diaspora that we mentioned earlier, the product of the slave trade and the colonial system, and then the more contemporary diaspora, which is made up of international students, of refugees, of professionals, economic migrants, family reunion, and so on. And then on the continent, you have also intra-African diasporas, so those people who have moved from their home country but to another African country, still within the continent. They're not included under the AU definition, but they are an important part of understanding the role of diasporas. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the role of diasporas of other countries living in Africa, such as in larger numbers, Europeans, Chinese, Indians, and here we might also include Australians, even in smaller numbers. And interestingly, what Muguru identified was, and this is about 10 years ago when he was writing, was an emerging conflict of interest in how the African Union organization and its member states were both at the same time trying to court the African diaspora, particularly in terms of how resources might flow back from the diaspora to the African continent, each pursuing different and sometimes conflicting forms of diaspora diplomacy. His argument was ultimately that there needed to be a division of labour between the African Union and its own member states, in which the African Union would focus on the historical diaspora. Again, many people of whom are historically disconnected from their places of origin. It's not always known where specifically people have come from as part of the forced removal. So the African Union would focus on the historical I guess, development needs of the historical African diaspora, whereas individual countries would then sort of have a free space to focus on the diplomacy of their own diasporas abroad, and obviously thinking about how resources might come back into African countries through those processes. So that's quite an interesting tension that has emerged in the diaspora diplomacy of the continent and its countries. Next slide. When it comes to thinking about this specifically in the Australian context, and particularly in terms of Australia's foreign policy towards Africa, one of the challenges, of course, that we face in Australia is that Africa is not seen as a priority for the Australian government or for Australia's foreign policy relationships in the world. It's certainly on the margins and doesn't receive a lot of attention or focus. It's been characterized as a kind of engagement that is very episodic rather than strategic. It's kind of, maybe heightened engagement for a few years and then a retreat for a number of years, and then not a consistent approach to how we connect Australia with the African continent. Australia only has 9 diplomatic posts across 55 countries of Africa, so a very limited diplomatic footprint. And accompanying that is really limited engagement and only a small amount of resourcing towards this. There have been some obviously shared historical connections through the colonial system, through the Commonwealth, through various Cold War interests. But it's fair to say that Australia is very much focused on the sort of Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, and Africa doesn't really sit prominently in the way that Australia sees the world. So in that context, what we have started to see emerging is a recognition that the role of the growing African diasporas in Australia is perhaps one of the most important drivers of how Australia will think about and relate to the African continent going forward. It's one of the most dynamic parts of the relationship. And so there's a recognition that Australia might need to think about how it would harness the resource that is the African diaspora in Australia, the people-to-people connections, the knowledge that the people in the diaspora bring, the ideas, the networks that migrants have, how they could provide a new impetus and a range of resources to the Australian government in how it would actually think about Africa and then relate formally to African countries and to, to the African continent as a whole. But as part of this and as part of our research, we've identified that there are a number of challenges and concerns around this. One is, of course, this increasing emphasis on foreign influence or foreign interference. This has not been targeted at Africans per se, but it's become an increasing conversation in Australia and elsewhere about looking carefully at the role of diasporas and how they are linked or not linked to different governments or other political organizations in home countries. There has been some mention of some African cases in this respect, but it's certainly not been the focus of the Australian government's concerns around foreign interference so far. There are, I guess, challenges around for the government in identifying who in the diaspora represents different communities and how recognizing different diaspora organizations might create potential diplomatic tensions with formal diplomatic representation of African governments in Australia, particularly when diaspora organizations might represent opposition groups or exiled groups. So the government is very wary of creating entities that might give formal recognition to organizations that might create political problems in their formal relations. And there's also a concern that the government is not ready to commit substantial resources to the relationships with Africa, and hence there's a reluctance to create expectations within the diaspora that couldn't be met through government policy or government resources. So that's the context on the sort of Australian side. If we go to the next slide, I'll just talk through some of the preliminary findings that we've had from the other interviews and research that we've been doing in terms of diaspora diplomacy. So we've seen that African diasporas in Australia have really only been the subject of very limited attention in diaspora diplomacy by the Australian government, as I've just mentioned, but also by the African Union, by the CEDA's own identification. They haven't really focused on Australia. As we said, it's the 12th largest of the African diasporas in the world. So there's other larger diasporas that the AU itself has been focused on. But there was also a recognition that there needed to start to be much more focus on engaging the African diaspora here in Australia and other parts of the Pacific. There is a recognition by African governments that the African diaspora in Australia represent a major actual and future potential resource for African home governments, particularly skilled professionals who are agents of important social, intellectual, and technological and economic remittances back to home countries. And they can also be sources of investment that would be significant contributors to national development objectives, but also that they can be important tools of soft power. Again, if they're aligned with current government politics, then they might be a useful source of soft power for those governments. But what we've seen is that there's a huge amount of variation. So the African diasporas and diplomatic posts in Australia relate very differently to one another. Context is really important. There's no uniform relationships given the diversity of sizes, of political orientations, levels of community organisation, reasons for migration, and so on. Some governments have diaspora engagement strategies and even formal diaspora units in their foreign ministries, whereas others don't. Some African governments allow dual citizenship and voting rights, which significantly affect how diasporas can relate to home countries, but others don't have those provisions. some governments are represented in Australia physically, others are non-resident. The embassies are based in other countries, so there's a less direct connection to the diaspora in Australia. Some governments have very active engagement with their diasporas, whereas others had very limited engagement and actually in some cases very limited information or knowledge about the scope and the activities of their own diasporas in Australia. If we go to the next slide. For some countries, there was a recognition that diasporas are also a resource specifically for political parties, both opposition and government parties, and that they can provide important financial sort of promotional resources. They are an important source of voting in elections. They can also be elected from the diaspora in some cases if that's permitted, and we've seen examples of that in Australia. But diasporas can also be vocal critics of home governments. So this kind of diaspora diplomacy can damage national reputation in informal settings. It can actually create diplomatic pressure when there's a lot of successful advocacy by diaspora organisations. And they can, of course, become subjects of foreign interference, which obviously is a concern for governments, both home and of origin. I won't go into some of the other aspects which look at how diasporas are also becoming important voting blocs in Australia, and that's part of our broader project. But what we have seen is a willingness by members of the diaspora and diaspora organisations to play a much more agential role, both in Australia, but specifically in this context, as agents of diaspora diplomacy. A willingness to do that, but a great frustration that there's a lack of support or a lack of mechanisms in order to do that. There's a range of other frustrations that I won't go into, but my colleague, Associate Professor Dominic Dagbanja, has written about as part of this project. You can look at his recent policy report looking at some of the barriers to diaspora playing this more influential role, particularly in areas like trade. So I'll leave that work there and you can go and find that. I'll come to the end shortly. 2 more slides. So in terms of what we think needs to happen going forward to enhance the political agency of African diaspora as agents of diaspora diplomacy in Australia, really this is about building some of the fundamental pieces of infrastructure, knowledge infrastructure and policy infrastructure in Australia, which don't currently exist, as a way to harness and empower the African diaspora in the broader building of relations between our continents. So the first and most fundamental is this ongoing process to develop Australia-Africa literacy, basic understanding of each other, of different continents, but also of the diaspora itself. The role of African studies, which we don't have in Australia. Obviously, the work we're doing through the Centre for Australia-Africa Relations is dedicated to this, but also through the media, through the role of community organisations and so on. This all needs to be happening as a baseline, as a foundation for everything that will come. But more specifically, we would need to look at how eligible young members of the African diaspora could get directly involved in the processes of foreign policy making and diplomacy. So incentivising people from the diaspora to get involved in, for example, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, through graduate programs or through some of the emerging leader programs. We've run the Emerging Leaders in Australia Africa Diplomacy program with 36 emerging leaders. Just recently, I was in Canberra at the Young Australians in International Affairs event, which is focusing on getting young people from diverse backgrounds interested in foreign affairs, and we're supporting the 2 African fellows in that program. So how do we get people directly involved in the making of foreign policy and the delivery of diplomacy that reflects the knowledge and the experiences of the diaspora? So that's an important recommendation. A second one is that the Department of Foreign Affairs would actually create a diaspora unit within the department, so specifically focusing on how the department engages with diasporas, not just African diasporas, but all diasporas. This is something that's been recommended in the past, but so far hasn't been adopted. And because of that, we don't have a systemic way of engaging diasporas in foreign policy making. And what we have seen is a sort of ad hoc response to crises. So one that's been cited is the response to the situation in Sudan when civil war broke out again a few years ago. The government had to try and quickly convene meetings of the Sudanese diaspora to get a better understanding of that conflict. But if something more structured had been in place before that, then those kind of processes would have been easier, and it would have enhanced the agency of the diaspora to play an important role in informing the government on what was happening there. And then finally, and more broadly, what we've suggested we really need is a National Australia-Africa Council, which would be a central body that would bring together representatives of different sectors with government in a very structured and ongoing process. If you just go to the next slide, we've proposed one model of this, which would include, importantly, a central pillar for diaspora organisations that would then have a regular interaction with government, including with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and other government entities, as well as the African Union, as well as the African Diplomatic Corps, so that we can have this much more structured interaction, so that government can benefit from the resources in the diaspora, but also the diaspora can benefit from potentially resources that might come down. So it's a mutual process. This would also bring other sectors into a much more structured engagement with the diaspora. So the higher education and research sector that we work in, as well as the commercial sector, where there's, again, a lot of activity going on. There's a lot of diaspora businesses that are looking to do more business into Africa, but face a range of barriers. So this kind of structure would, in my view, be the first thing that we need to bring everybody around the table and to start to develop a national strategy for how we engage with the African continent, as an important part of that, the role of diaspora diplomacy. So I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David. We're now at the end of the presentation. It was very enlightening, very interesting. I was scribbling notes myself. We'll now have time for about maybe 2 or 3 questions. I see there's a comment in the chat, so I think I'll start there. And then if there are any other questions from the audience, please put them in the chat or use the raise hand feature, and I'll use that to select people to ask a question. So in the chat, guest David, I'd like to know what your thoughts are about a Pillar D that has been suggested with NGOs and not-for-profits working across the 2 continents. So what do you think about it?
Thanks, Nina, for that question. That's actually one that's come up again recently. We had a series of interactions with ACFID, and they also recommended that there should be a Pillar D for NGOs and development organisations. So I think that would certainly be something that we could add to that. Again, a sector where there's a lot of activity connecting Australia and Africa, and I think you probably might agree a frustration that we don't have these kind of mechanisms in place to really systematically resource those entities, but also to exchange information in an ongoing way. So I think the next version of the slides will have a Pillar D as well.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions or comments that they'd like to raise to David? If not, okay, Dominic does. Dom, you can turn on your mic.
Okay, David, thank you very much for your excellent presentation covering a variety of issues. In the proposals, maybe I missed it, but I'm wondering whether formal structures in Australia representing the various African countries, the diplomatic missions, embassies, their potential role in promoting diaspora diplomacy that you are just presented on. I think I would want to think that they have a crucial role to play that. In fact, some of them even require the Africans in Australia to register with them and identify themselves with them, attend their programs and so forth. And in fact, they facilitate the issuance, for example, of passports and other official documents and so forth. So I think they are very important in the nature of activities of Africa diaspora in Australia that we potentially should be looking at.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. No, absolutely. And as I said at the start, most of our interviews so far have been with the African diplomats, including ambassadors, in understanding their role and the role of the high commissions or embassies as central to this process. But what we identified was quite a variation in how each diplomatic post relates to their diaspora in Australia. There's some common features, but there's also a lot of differences in how those relationships take place. So it's really quite unique as to how each country perceives its diaspora. Of course, they have some formal functions to fulfill, such as the consular services and so on. But beyond that, it's quite a varied relationship. And within the diaspora itself, of course, the diaspora is very diverse. You have perhaps individuals and organizations that might be aligned with the current government, but you also have those that might be in opposition. So the way that the formal diplomatic post can relate to its diaspora is quite variable. And that was quite one of the interesting findings that came out of the research so far, is that there's actually the context matters across those different factors. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. We have Professor Mickler and Patricia, so we'll take the questions maybe in that order. If you can both ask your questions and then David, you can answer them. And I think we'll have enough time for just those two.
Thanks.
So Sam.
Still on mute.
I'll unmute you. You mind?
It's still mute.
Yeah, you're still muted.
Maybe he hasn't realized he's mute.
Okay. I'm unable to unmute you on my end.
Let me see.
Maybe whilst we're working through his camera, Patricia, can you ask your question and then I'll be troubleshooting Samuel's on the side?
Or just get him to put the question on the chat if possible.
Can I ask my question now? Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. And David, this is excellent. Just wanting to put the question that I had asked in a previous seminar where I mentioned about the lack of appreciation of the close connection between foreign policy and multicultural policy, and how if it was in the right hands, we would actually be able to use this as a very source of transformative change. And just wanting to see particularly the role of diaspora in this particular area of how we can see the connections between foreign policy and multicultural policy. And I'm coming from a background of having worked as a humanitarian aid and development worker in the last 25 years, where I did work a lot in Africa. And it is from that background of working as a humanitarian aid development in Africa that I realized that particularly since the original Africa Aid concert in Ethiopia in the 1980s, since that time, which also correlated with the increase in the African diaspora population from the 1990s onwards, when we had huge amounts of Africans coming from Horn of Africa, Southern Africa, and where the conflicts were occurring. That put a lot of focus on Australians giving the biggest amount of humanitarian aid to Africa. And I have that as my proof, working for 10 years with the UNHCR agency, where the amount of funding and also from the resources of ACFID, all the aid agencies, greatest source of funding for their appeals, emergency appeals in relation to the humanitarian crisis, was being provided to Africa. And that's where we generated the biggest amount of support. In other words, Australians really gave more to Africa than any other region. And that's something that has continued until today.
Mm.
We still give in proportion to the other regions. So I think that's something of an important connection that we need to be able to, I think, also work on, and particularly the role of NGOs in being able to build that what we call people-to-people relationships, that sort of non-state actor intersocial diplomacy that you talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. No, some great points there. And going to the first one, I totally agree with you about the linking of sort of foreign and domestic policy or multicultural policy. In the diagram that we put up of the council model, we would certainly want to have, we do have in there sort of home affairs and foreign affairs as being key audiences, but also participants in that kind of council. One of the challenges that I think we have at the moment in Australia is that diaspora is seen as a home affairs issue and not really taken seriously by foreign affairs, and hence the sort of promotion of this idea of diaspora diplomacy as a significant potential resource for foreign affairs. But you would need to certainly have that as a connected up conversation on an ongoing basis. I think that at the moment, obviously things have changed since the 80s, but one of the most recent developments is the withdrawal of a lot of US foreign aid, which is, obviously a disaster in many cases, but it's also opening up a conversation about, other forms of support beyond, traditional foreign aid and other actors being involved, which might also lead to, less forms of dependency in certain circumstances. So there's a potential role for Australia to play in that space with a retreat of not just the US, but the UK and other European countries from the way in which they were providing aid. But it's also, again, a role for diaspora because, as we saw, the remittances that go back are far outweigh a lot of the formal forms of funding and aid that go into Africa. So, again, any discussion that's taking place now should include the role of diaspora in addition to organisations that you mentioned. Thanks.
Now, can I talk now?
Yeah.
Yes, we'll just take your question, then we'll wrap up after this question because I recognize it's our time.
All right. I'm not criticizing anything that has been presented here, but I was just wondering how this type of research can be expanded to look at the way that the AU and African governments are more or less using the diasporas as a commodity and something that has to provide for foreign currency supply. And as a result, some of the countries are actually ignoring their own economies and more or less sending out young people to work in different places. We complain, historically people complain that Africans were being sent away to work as slaves and whatnot there. Well, now we're sending them out in developed countries where they work about 3 shifts a day in order to raise money for their countries. And those countries have ignored their own major export commodities, like say Kenya, tea and coffee have now been ignored. And the diaspora is the main source of foreign currency. So I just wonder how a project like this, which is quite good, I like it, but I wonder how it can be expanded to take into account some of those dynamics that are taking place out there between, say, Australia and the AU and Australia and various African countries that are exporting their own young people in order to earn foreign currency. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And we had a chat about this last week as well, so it's a really important part of the discussion. As I said, I think you can read the African Union definition of diaspora as a very instrumental way of thinking about how to harness the resources of the diaspora. And if that's just taken in isolation, it could be criticised for exactly the things that you're talking about. But it may actually be a strategy of some governments. I mean, this might be their economic and foreign policy strategy going forward to harness the diaspora as one of the most significant sources of foreign currency that they can earn. Maybe this is a new form of economic diplomacy. And you could criticize it, but you could also see it as a way in which governments are trying to navigate their own circumstances in the world. Obviously, you wouldn't want to see it as an exploitative system, but it is, it is a system that is used, that is generating significant revenue for home governments. Also, you're seeing again this competition then for who harnesses, who can tax the remittances on the way back in. And there's been various different entities wanting to be the ones who obtain the tax income that comes in from the diaspora. And Ntando, as part of our project, will be looking at this notion of the black tax as part of her own master's research in this project. So she can maybe fill us in on some of these issues when she's ready.
Awesome. Thank you for that robust conversation. Unfortunately, we are running over time, so we won't be able to take anything that's in the chat, but we will collate this information for David's information. But thank you so much for everyone who has joined us. Thank you, David, for your presentation and for answering the questions. It was very enlightening, obviously, very exciting conversation. We will have this recording again up on our website within the next coming 2 weeks. And otherwise, we will see you at the next webinar. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.